Greetings and welcome to week 2, Introduction to Animation for the Web. This week we're going to take a look at animation in general and what web animation means, and you're also going to do a little bit of storyboarding, and you'll get an introduction to Adobe Animate. Did you know Flash is dead? I opened this as the first slide because next year, 2020, Flash will be completely deprecated as a recognized format for the web. That means it's pretty much dead, and Adobe will no longer support it. Flash was the animation tool of choice for many decades. However, web technologies have advanced to the degree that we can now create most of our animations within the browser. Another issue that's really important is the emergence of or issue that's had some bearing on Flash's lifespan has been the emergence of mobile devices and web standards, and the need to make the web accessible. So what is web animation? Well, there are two organizations which I think one set the standards for a lot of what goes on in the web, and that's the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, and the Mozilla Developers Network. And according to the W3C, web animations define a model for supporting animation and synchronization on the web platform. And that kind of sounds very formal, but basically they're referring to a technology that describes a model for us to add motion to the screen or to a web page. Mozilla has developed a lot of standards around the Web Animations API in concert with W3C. And the Web Animations API, you can think of it as basically a technology that provides some common language for all browsers and developers to describe animation or movement of DOM elements. Basically, to animate the DOM. The DOM is the document object model, and it's basically how the browser conceptualizes the content within a web page. And the elements within the web page, like your paragraphs and your headlines or your divisions or sections within the web page, the Web Animations API standard allows us to basically access those elements and animate them. So this API allows us to access those elements and then synchronize and time changes within the web page. For example, as I mentioned previously, animation of DOM elements. And it basically combines two models that we'll talk about a little bit in the coming weeks, and it's the timing model and the animation model. And again, we'll talk about that some more, particularly when we take a look at HTML5 Canvas. So web animation is kind of emerging and still in its infancy. So let's take a look at some of the emerging web animation technologies. One that you may have seen from other classes is very straightforward, and it's been around for many decades. In fact, back when I started working with the web back in the late 90s, animated GIFs were the only way to really make an animation, and Flash hadn't emerged yet. So an animated GIF is an image format that's encoded, and it's called graphic interchange format, or GIF, and you're probably familiar with that. But an animated GIF basically contains frames that are presented in a linear fashion with very little transition or interpolation on the part of the browser to convey a sense of movement. So an animated GIF is really like the old-fashioned flip book. The sense of movement is implied as you move from frame to frame or picture to picture, but what goes on from one frame to the next is not interpolated. But the illusion of motion occurs by flipping the flip book or the frames. Recently, CSS animations has really come into its own. These are animations that make it possible to animate and transform from one CSS style or configuration to another. For example, animating or moving text, or animating buttons is a good example of CSS animations. And years ago, back of course when I was starting with the web, we actually had to create several graphics to represent the states of our buttons and use JavaScript to animate menus. And CSS has, specifically in that example, made it possible for us to use and configure styles to represent the animation. And CSS animations consist of two components: a style describing the animation, and then a set of keyframes to indicate the starting point and the ending point or states of the animation style. But this is specific to style. So what CSS is changing, animating changes in styles. HTML5 Canvas uses the canvas element. The canvas element is a block HTML element. It's basically like a division. If you're familiar with HTML, it's basically like a div or the nav tag or the section tag. It's a block element, which means that it moves to its own line. It has its own block in a web page. It doesn't sit in line with other elements. And it's used to draw graphics using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So Canvas, as you'll hear me mention, or the term Canvas, basically uses CSS and JavaScript within that Canvas element to depict all of your animations. As you'll see with Adobe Animate, and one of the reasons we're using Adobe Animate is because it uses HTML5 Canvas. And so Canvas is a pretty popular animation technology, if you will, but it has competitors, and we haven't really seen, I think, in the industry and amongst web developers a specific approach that has gained dominance. WebGL is a JavaScript API for rendering 3D and 2D graphics, and it's compatible with most web browsers, and it does so without the use of a plugin. WebGL uses the Canvas element as well as CSS and JavaScript. SVG, Scalable Vector Graphics, is an XML-based vector image format for 2D graphics, and it can support interactivity and animation. So an SVG, you can interact with it, for example, via the keyboard or the mouse or what have you, and you can animate it. It can be styled with CSS, and the interactivity is added using JavaScript. HTML5, the HTML5 standard now, the current standard for HTML, allows direct embedding of SVG tags in an HTML document. And that's nice because, unlike Canvas, we're not stuck with just that one block element. We can use SVG within the HTML document and not be constrained by that one block. And then, of course, there are a wealth of JavaScript libraries. And so I talked about, when I started with the web, that animated GIFs were kind of the standard way to animate things. And in fact, because the bandwidth was so low, sometimes animated GIFs would take forever to render. And so it wasn't really pretty. And then Flash came out, and Flash was just, like, to us, amazing, because we could do very fancy things with animation. But JavaScript was around as well. And a lot of developers back in the early 2000s were using JavaScript, not so much CSS, but just JavaScript, to animate elements. But it was very complex because it was just vanilla JavaScript. And so what has happened in this century sadly, I'm getting kind of old, is that developers have put together JavaScript libraries, which sort of, if you can think of them as sort of a black box where you can access um, the library to change properties and methods of an object within a web page. So again, you're actually still manipulating the DOM, but it's basically automated for you. So libraries include some canned functions and features and technologies that make it easy for you, once you have a web page, to access the elements in the page and then animate them. So jQuery is a popular one, for example. Velocity.js is another. AngularJS is popular. And then we'll see with Adobe Animate, Create.js is also a library that's used. And there are a wealth of animation libraries and game libraries out there. In terms of creating web animations, it's not that easy to do it. You really need to understand coding if you're going to make something really rich and fancy. Web animation tools and editors that are currently available use Canvas, SVG, HTML5, and CSS3 and JavaScript. And the two most popular that I would say at this time is Adobe Animate and Google Web Designer. Now you might be wondering, where's After Effects? Well, After Effects is not a web animation tool. You can create motion graphics and animation with After Effects, but you output to MP4, which is then embedded within the web page, and it's a self-contained object, and there's no possibility for interactivity. So Adobe Animate and Google Web Designer are basically tools that allow you to create animations, and all the coding is done in the background for you. And so that's why we're starting with Animate and this Canvas element, so you can see how Animate uses Canvas and Create.js and the JavaScript along with CSS to create the animation. In a lot of respects, it's self-serving, and you get a lot of code. Google Web Designer, however, is kind of a obscure tool because a lot of people don't know about it, and Google hasn't done a good job marketing it. It's used primarily to create ads that meet Google's specific standards. However, you can also use it to create web animations, beautiful web animations, and it pretty much scripts clean HTML5, CSS3, and JavaScript, and doesn't rely on a library, although you can point to a library should you want to use it. Well, that was a very brief introduction to web animation standards and concepts and tools. What I'd like you to do is to take a look at some of the links that I provided in Canvas and explore some of the technologies and concepts. And I have some examples of websites that use those technologies. And then the next topic that we'll be discussing are the principles of animation.